everybody, welcome back to Jacey's Creek. My name's Emily, and today we are doing episode 2, Homecoming. Before I start, I want to say, if you have not already, make sure to follow my Instagram, that's Witter and Potter, and my TikTok, that's Pacey and Joey. And without further ado, let's get into it. So, this episode came out on October 6, 1999, and happy April, by the way. So, this episode kind of starts with Pacey. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of Pacey, Andy, and Joey's storyline going on here. So, scene 1 of Pacey starts with Pacey and Dawson are outside of Cape Side High, and Pacey says, "I'm gonna explode, man. I mean, my insides are gurgling. Who gurgles at 16 unless they're gonna explode? Huh?" And Dawson says, "You're not gonna explode." And Pacey says, "Really? How do you know that, huh? I mean, some guy in Norway blew up in the middle of the supermarket last year." Which I'm like, okay, Pacey. And Dawson says, "Nervous anticipation does not cause super compressions." And Pacey says, "Who said I was nervous?" Like, Pacey, you said that like 15 times that you were nervous. And Dawson says, "It's natural that you're nervous, man. You see Andy in less than 6 hours?" So now we get to find out that Andy and Pacey finally get to see each other after a whole summer. So Pacey says, 5 hours, 20 minutes if the traffic's right. And then he holds his stomach. "I guess I'm a little nervous, but what did you expect?" And Dawson says, "Is your dad still letting you pick, her dad still letting you pick her up?" And Pacey said, "Absolutely, this train cuts at lunch." And Dawson says, "Need some company?" And Pacey says, "Actually, Joey's going with me. She wanted to see Andy, and per our conversation last week." And can we note that Dawson says, "Absolutely. No one welcomes a Witter Potter duo more than me." Okay, so a few thoughts on this so far. I want to say that obviously Pacey and Joey have been talking about Andy, and it's just proof that them two talk about certain things with each other. And then the second thing, I love how Dawson says, "No one welcomes a Potter Witter duet more than me." And then he continues by saying, "I'm glad she has someone. It's only help as Joey and I weave through our separate ways through this pathless what we call life." And I love how he's just like, "I know that Joey's lonely at the moment, but I know that you will take care of her." And I love how Dawson thinks that Pacey will take good care of Joey, but at the same time later in the season we obviously know what happens if you watch the whole show, how Dawson does not approve of them two, and Pacey later says in the whole season, "You were the one who had told me to take care of Joey, and I fell for her. I'm sorry." And I just think that this goes back to it, because Dawson was very accepting until the very end. And so Pacey says, "Speaking of woods, Dawson, whatever happened with a certain bus girl?" And Dawson says, "Don't ask. She vanished, disappeared, John A. Kerna into the air." And Pacey says, "You let her get away?" And Dawson says, "I have slightly irritation father to ask, Pacey. It's my life, you know?" And Pacey says, "So what happened since?" And Dawson said, "With Eve? Who else?" "I haven't been able to find her." And Pacey says, "Did you check down at the strip joint?" And Dawson says, "Embarrassingly, yes. Turns out she doesn't even work there anymore. She was a temp." And Pacey says, "Strip joints have temps." And then we see them enter the school, and they're walking down the hallway, and this is one of my favorite parts, because Dawson says, "The only information I have about her is her first name. Who knows if that's even real?" And Pacey's like, "Well, that's too bad, Dawson, because Eve was an enormous transition woman." And I will always prop how Pacey was always written by someone saying he never called them girl, he always called them women. If they were old enough to be a teenager, he was like, "Yeah, that woman over there." I'm like, dang, I wish someone would say that to me instead of get, "Hey, you." And I'm like, are you talking to me? That's what I get. And Dawson says, "How do you figure? But since you were young, violence increasing Oh, and so Pacey says, well, you're coming off a little emotional trauma, life-alternating relationship, and the last thing you need to do is get emotionally involved again, right? But since we are a long and increasing buff teenager male, you have certain wants and desires. And then Eve randomly kind of pulls Dawson away, and and Pacey has no idea. And Dawson gets pulled into the closet, and Pacey still goes on with his whole speech like a feminine florence who enters genetic code screaming, I'm telling you, Dawson, if you find her, do not let her out of your sight. And then he turns around, and he has his finger like pointing, and he's like, well, Dawson? Like, where'd you go? I love how Pacey was just like, whenever he gets like fed up with something, he starts making a speech, he like does not stop until that speech is completely over. And that's like one of my favorite things about Pacey. And so then the next scene we have is scene 1 of Pacey and Joey. So it cuts to Pacey at the with the kind of like, I don't really know what to call it. I kind of called it a mental institution because that's kind of what it reminded me of, so I'm just going to keep calling it that. The mental institution Andy has been at all summer, and he's talking to the nurse at the front desk, and the nurse is kind of a jerk about it. She says Andy McPhee is scheduled to be released tomorrow, not today. And Pacey says, that's why it's a surprise. And the nurse is like, we try to avoid surprises. The only way she leaves today is with her written consent. So my question is this, if you ever, I don't know, like, how old enough my audience is, but if you ever watched iCarly, it kind of reminds me of when Sam checked herself into a mental institution. That's kind of what it reminds me of in this moment, where they can just check themselves in or out. And I kind of think, like, I know Andy wanted help, but if she really, really needed to, like, she could just easily check herself out. Like, that's what happens. And Pacey says, which I will give if you let me walk through the door and talk to her. And the nurse says, and that would be 9 a.m. when visiting hours resume, and not a minute earlier. And Pacey's like, you gotta be kidding me. And the nurse is like, does this look like a face that kids? And it cuts to Pacey walking towards Joey, who is sitting on the truck, and I love how he goes, this is ridiculous. And Joey's like, what happened? And I love Joey's shirt. It's like one of my favorite things about the whole thing. And Pacey says, well, the clinic doesn't allow visitors after hours. So substitutely, I can't talk to Andy. Substitutely, I can't get her permission to take her home. And Joey nods, and then I love how she holds out her hand, and she's like putting her hand, I'm like demonstrating what she's doing, I realize you guys can't see me, but she's like holding her hand, and she's kind of like making it like, come on, take my hand, and he just like awkwardly takes her hand, and she goes, follow me, and she like drags him out. She drags him to the institution thing, and it cuts to Joey talking to the nurse. But first, can I say, I love how she just drags him along, and he's just like, oh, okay, I guess this is happening. It just kind of shows how comfortable they are with each other, even though they claim to hate each other for years. So it cuts to Joey talking to the nurse, and Joey's like, you don't understand, I have to see a doctor immediately. And the nurse is like, this is a private care practically, unless it's a medical emergency, we don't take walk-ins. And Joey's like, this is a moral injustice. I have psychiatric concerns. And the nurse is like, well, obviously, which I'm like, dang, okay. And Joey says, fine. If that's what it is, then you'll just have to do. And the nurse is like, oh, excuse me. And Joey like moves the stuff and like sits on the desk and leans against the wall. And she says, well, somebody's gotta listen to me. I had a tough life, lady, and I have a lot to talk about. It's just when I fell in love with this boy down the creek, that was after my mom died of cancer, but before my dad went to jail for the second time. And I love how like she's going on a whole rant about Dawson, but she like takes her hand, she motions Pacey to like army crawl by the receptionist, and she's like, the boy's name is Dawson. He was the typical overanalyzed, adorable teenage boy who happened to be my best friend. And I just love how Pacey's just like on the ground, just like army crawling, and Joey's just helping Pacey out. This would have never happened in season 2. I believe it might have happened in season 1 if Joey asked or if Pacey asked, but I don't think it ever would. I think they would be bickering back and forth before they could even get into the door. And no way would he ever take her hand, because I think he would be a nervous wreck. Which maybe he was, but I don't really know. Then again, he did have Andy as girlfriend in this episode. So then we have scene 2 of Pacey and Joey. And it cuts to Pacey walking upstairs and like looking for Andy's room. And he finds it and he opens up to reveal Andy laying on the bed talking to a guy who, aka, is named Marcus. And Andy's like really shocked that Pacey's here, and she's like, Pacey, oh my god, what are you doing here? And Pacey runs and picks her up, and Pacey's like, I came to surprise you. And Andy's like, yeah, okay, yeah. And she knows Mark is kind of still there, and she's like, oh, Pacey, this is Mark, this is a surprise. And they, like, Pacey and him shake hands, and they greet each other, and Andy says, I thought my dad said he was going to pick me up tomorrow. And Pacey says, yeah, I know, but I thought, and Andy kind of laughs, and Mark says, well, it's dinner time, I'll come back. And Andy says, bye, Mark, and like, kind of like that was not right kind of tone, if you know what I mean. And Mark says, we'll talk soon, though. And Andy says, yeah, we will. And Mark leaves, and that's when Joey walks into the doorway, and Joey goes, Andy. And Andy gives a better reaction to Joey walking through the door than she did with Pacey. And she goes, oh, Joey, you came too. And Joey's like, yeah, but if we don't leave soon, then they're going to make me stay. And Andy's obviously confused, like, what the heck, why did you say that? It's literally because the nurse was like, okay, well, she said that she has security concerns, so... And Pacey's like, yeah, I guess we should pack up, huh? And Andy says, right. And she moves to start getting her things, and Pacey gives and Joey to look like he knows something is up, which obviously he did, but I love how he just motions towards, like, Joey, like, hey, something is not right here, and I'm not sure what it is. I wish we knew how much Joey and Pacey actually talked about Andy. I wish we saw the conversation of when he asked her to come with, like, oh, I want to come too. So then the next part of this scene is where Pacey, Joey, and Andy are carrying Andy's boxes out of the car and out to the car. And Pacey says, Mark seems like a pretty nice guy. What's he in here for anyway? Which I'm like, dang, Pacey, back off. That's actually private. Like, you should not ask someone that. And Andy says, that's private, Pacey. And Pacey says, come on, it's just us. And Andy says, let's not talk about Mark, okay, please. And at first, when I was, like, listening to this, I thought she said mac and cheese or something. I was like, what the heck? Anyway, so Pacey says, well, it seems a little bit odd. I mean, you guys seem pretty close, yet you never mention him in any of your letters or your emails. So, I actually have a song that always reminds me of Andy and Pacey. So if you're a big fan of Taylor Swift, you may already know where I'm going with this. Maybe you don't. But it's Closure by Taylor Swift. Sorry if you hear like a little bit of typing. And the part that reminds me of it was when I'm trying to find it. It goes, it's been a long time, and seeing the shape of your name still spells out pain. It wasn't right the way it all went down. Looks like you know that now. Yes, I got your letter. Yes, I'm doing better. It cut deep to know you, right to the bone. Yes, I got your letter. Yes, I'm doing better. I know that it's over. I don't need your closure. Don't treat me like some situation that needs to be handled. I'm fine with my spoon and my tears and my beers and my candles. I can feel you smoothing me over. Yes, I got your letter. Yes, I'm doing better. It cuts to the bone to know. So the reason why this reminds me of Andy and Pacey was because I always thought about how they had letters and they were writing, and obviously in this episode a lot of things go down between them two, but it's just kind of like when she was in that facility, it was like she was just dealing with everything, and obviously they weren't over, like they were planning on staying together, and that's no secret that they did break up. But I feel like when we get more into the episode, we kind of see how they dated apart. I think one of the episodes, I think it was the wedding, where I was like, the first time I watched it, I'm like, man, they're gonna break up soon, aren't they? Because it wasn't just one of those things where I'm like, something is off with Andy, and I feel like she doesn't really love him as much as she says that she does. So with this episode, I feel like when Pacey was like, you never wrote anything in your letter, yet you mentioned how, when you seem so close, how come you never said anything? And obviously Andy was kind of uncomfortable, and I love how Joey's just like, Pacey, drop the male jealousy thing, and Pacey's like, it's a long walk home, Potter. So my point in like the whole closure thing was there was a lot of things going down, and it just ended up badly. So therefore, it would kind of be like Andy's point of view when you really think about it. But again, I love how Joey says, Pacey, drop the male jealousy thing, and Pacey's like, it's a long walk, Potter. And Andy's like, is that what it is? This is about? You're jealous? Which, I mean, Andy, what did you expect him to be, like, okay with a male being there? And Pacey says, how can I not be, Andy? I spent months counting the moments until I get to see you again. And the thought of you and some other guy getting to see you every day and hear your stories and eat dinner with you just kills me. And they kiss. And I love Joey's reaction to this. She says, finally, the reunion kiss we all been waiting for. So, let's go. I love how Joey was like, okay, finally, we get this done. Bye-bye, let's go. I don't need to see this. And the next scene is we have scene 3 of Pacey and Joey. And it cuts to Pacey and Andy and Joey getting in the car. And Pacey's like, we should be arriving at Cape Side around 10. So pick your station's requests now. And Joey says, Ardon Natural. And Pacey says, classic rock it is. Like, he just completely ignores Joey. Like, I'm not listening to your music, I'm listening to my music. And no, I just love Pacey's music. I can get the feel of what his music is, and I'm like, I love it. And Pacey looks over at Andy, who is just looking not happy at all to be there. She's like, why the heck am I here? And obviously there was something going on between Mark and Andy, and Pacey knows that. And Pacey says, you okay, Andy? And Andy says, yeah, I'm just happy to be with you and to be going home, which obviously she's not. And she turns back towards the window as Pacey looks at her, knowing something is wrong completely. Like, I just love how Pacey just knows. And then we have scene 2 of Pacey, and it cuts to Andy opening her locker the next day at school, and Jack walks up, and Jack says, how is your classes going? Gorgeous? And Andy says, very well, I must say. And Jack says, I missed you so much. And Andy hugs him, and Andy says, I missed you too. But then Pacey kind of ruins the moment by coming up and pulling Jack away, and he said, hey, get your hands off my girlfriend. And Jack says, get your hands off my sister. And Pacey says to Andy, about tonight. And Andy says, what about it? And you can just still tell that she's not really talking to Pacey, and she's not really looking at Pacey. And Pacey says, well, it's your first Friday night back in town, and I was thinking you and I could catch a movie and scroll right down to our little spot. I love how he calls it our little spot. And Andy says, oh, well, I was thinking we could all grab dinner tonight, as a group. And Jack says, sorry, I promised Jen I'd like to go to that, and he's like, pep rally thing with her tonight. And Andy says, that could be fun. And Pacey says, well, in case you forgot, we're in a non-spiritual group, and pep rallies are all about the spirit. What about you and me? And Andy says, well, there's plenty of time for us to be alone. I just want to be with normal people right now. It's been a long time. And Pacey's like, well, what am I? And Jack says, well, she did say normal people. Like, I love how Jack just, like, chimes in. It's like, well, Pacey, you're not exactly normal, so she wasn't talking to you. But you can just tell that something's wrong with Andy and something's going on because she's not looking at him. She doesn't want to be alone with him. Like, obviously, something is completely wrong. So then we have scene 4 of Pacey and Joey. And I love how Pacey, like, gets Joey to come with him. Like, that's my favorite part about this whole thing. And Pacey says, you know, McPhee, if I didn't know better, I think you were trying to get away with, avoid being alone with me. And Andy says, no, I mean, we can be alone after or tomorrow, okay? And she kisses him on the cheek, and they say bye, and he starts introducing them. Okay. So then we have Pacey and Andy and Joey showing up and taking a seat. And Pacey says, personally, I think I've seen it enough. What do you guys say? And get out of here. And Joey's like, I agree. And Andy says, nope, we're here. We're staying put. And they notice Jack in a football jersey. And Joey's like, did you just see what I just saw? And Mitch is like, well, forever, Jack McPhee. And the crowd goes wild. And Pacey says, when did this happen? And Joey says, news to me. And Andy says, Jen's a cheerleader? And Jack's on the football team? I got sane and everyone else went crazy. I love how she's like amazed by everyone and everything. So then the next scene is where Pacey and Andy and Joey are sitting, and this is scene 3 of Pacey. And Pacey puts his arm around Andy, and Andy says, frisky much? And Pacey says, what can I say? Listening to you just gets me the best of me. And he says, what do you say? Scream for a little bit? And Andy says, in a little while. And Pacey says, come on, Miffy. And Andy says, I said in a little bit. And Pacey stands up and he's pulling her. And Andy says, what are you doing? And Pacey says, I want to talk to you, and I'd rather not do it in front of the whole school. And Andy follows Pacey into the hallway. And Joey's just sitting there like, you leaving me alone here? Like, you dragged me to this pep rally and you're just leaving me here? Like, what the heck is wrong with you people? And it cuts to Andy and Pacey out in the hallway. And Pacey says, okay, Andy, what the hell is going on? And don't tell me that it's just nothing, because you've been acting strange from the second I picked you up from that clinic. And now I have to beg you to spend some free time with me, so what is happening? And Andy says, we shouldn't talk about this here, Pacey. And Pacey says, so I'm right. And Andy says, look, this is not the time, okay? And Pacey says, is it me? Are you trying to end things with me? Is that what this is about? And Andy says, no, that's the last thing I want. And Pacey says, fine. Then what is so awful that you waited so long to tell me, Andy? And Andy says, a lot has happened to me this summer, Pacey, a lot. And Pacey says, what are you trying to say? And Andy says, okay, if we're going to talk about this now, then I need you to promise that you will not say one word until I'm done. And Pacey says, okay, go on. And Andy says, no, promise me, Pacey. And Pacey says, okay, I promise, just tell me what's wrong with you. And that's when Andy starts crying. And she says, when I went to Mayfield to get better, I was someone else. I wasn't the same person that came to Cape Side. I wasn't the girl you fell in love with. My first week I met Mark. He has been through a lot, and I went through more and more. In and out of faculties 3 times, off and on medication since he was 9. I didn't write to you about him because I didn't want you to get jealous. We were just friends. We spent our free time together just talking endlessly, mostly about our fears. I was afraid, Pacey, afraid of everything. I was scared that they were never going to let me out of there, or that whatever was broken inside of me wouldn't be able to be fixable. Mark, he understood those fears like nobody else, because they were his fears too. He even had a girlfriend, and he was anxious to get back to her. And I want to say first, before I even go to what Pacey's reaction was, I want to talk about Andy and how she was feeling in this moment, because what we saw last season with Andy, when she had her panic attack and her hallucinations and everything. I think plenty of people told her that she was going to get better, but her mind was such a dangerous place to be in. And I know that I'm full Team Pacey and Joey all the way. However, I do think with Andy, she was so vulnerable in that moment that obviously there was like things that like, oh, Pacey's never gonna love you. Oh, Pacey's gonna break up with you. Oh, Pacey's gonna do this when you're not looking. Oh, Pacey's not waiting for you. And that's what her mind is going to. And obviously there was just like, oh, like all these different what ifs. Like the what ifs can literally haunt you. You could write a whole fanfiction on just what ifs. And so when she went down there, she met Mark, and obviously that's the boy who Andy cheated with. And so she was like, oh, this boy is going through the same problems as me. That makes sense. Which makes a lot of sense in the beginning. Like, oh, it's nice to have a friend, but those friends, like, I noticed that whenever, like, teenagers are going through something and they'll influence other teenagers, like, if you have a friend who's doing something and they're already not in your right mind and you're not in your right mind, therefore mix those two together, put them in the blender, you get a not so great relationship. And that's what happened with Mark and Andy. So Pacey is obviously hurt by this, and he has no idea why she would do something to him like this at first. And he is like, you slept with him. And Andy's like, we knew immediately afterwards that it was wrong for both of us. And Pacey's like, you slept with him, Andy. And Andy's like, we both agreed to be friends and not tell our significant other. But Pacey, when I saw you, it was the biggest mistake I ever made in my life. And all I kept thinking about was, if you can't forgive me, Pacey, you have to forgive me. You have to. And Pacey is just disgusted by this and walks out the building, leaving Andy alone crying. So obviously it makes sense for Pacey to be upset. Like, honestly, you gotta think about this. Like, Pacey's reaction wasn't as bad as Dawson when he figured out that Joey kissed Jack. Like, I'm not justifying that Pacey wasn't mean to Andy in any type of way, or that he could have sat there and explained, but I think he walked away because he knew whatever came out of his mouth was not going to be a good thing. And he knew if he stood there and he just waited to talk to Andy, that it was not going to end up well for him or for her or for their breakup. So they needed that moment of just sitting there and being alone. So I feel like he did the right thing. A lot of people think that he didn't, like he was kind of being mean. But I don't think that he was being mean at all. I think he was just taking a moment. I feel like Pacey's that type of person that just processes things, like, slowly. What, this is kind of sad. What my dad used to do whenever I was, like, kind of annoying him, I was like, hey, we need to talk about this. Hey, we need to talk about this. And to this day, he still does this. He's like, I'm trying to process the information. And it finally, like, hit me, like, I'm like, oh, wait, I need to step back and let him have space. And I feel like that's how Pacey was. He just needed to step back and need space. So then we have one scene, the only scene of just Joey, or two scenes. There's actually two scenes of just Joey alone, but this is the same one of Joey. And Dawson is caught making out with Eve, and Joey is just sitting there, and she has to see him like this alone. I wonder what Pacey's reaction would have been if he saw Eve and Dawson. And she's obviously hurt by this because she's still trying to get over the emotions of what happened between her and Dawson. So then we have scene 5 of Pacey and Joey. And this is like, when I tell you that every single scene that we have is literally just Pacey and Joey throughout this whole episode, except a couple of scenes, I'm like, when I was like going through it, I was like, yes. So it cuts to Pacey driving Joey to her house, which I love how she's doing this. He's like giving her a ride, and Joey's like, well, I don't think we'll be attending any more prep rallies anytime soon, which, what a true to say. I just want to say that. And Pacey says, probably not. And Joey says, thanks for the ride. And Pacey says, no problem. And Joey says, Pacey, you probably don't want to hear this right now, and I'm sure you don't want to hear it from me, but you have to talk to her. And Pacey's like, no, not right now. I couldn't even look at her right now. And Joey says, you have to, Pacey. You have to hear her out. And Pacey says, why? What's the difference, Joey, huh? No matter what she says, the ending is still the same. She slept with someone else. And I love Joey's reaction to this, because Joey says, sorry, my dogs are acting a little bit crazy. Joey says, you think that just because the two of you are together that it doesn't hurt more? It doesn't. No, there's no difference, Pacey. I mean, look, she's 16 years old, and so are you. We talk like we know what's going on, but we don't. We have no idea. Look, we're already young. We screw up a lot, you know? And we're changing our minds and sometimes even our hearts. And even though all that, the only thing that we offer to each other is forgiveness. And I couldn't do that, or at least I did too late. Don't let yourself get too angry where one day you wake up from that anger and the person you love, will be gone. So at first when I watched this episode, I thought she was kind of talking about her dad, because she said, one day you'll wake up and that person you love will be gone. I thought she was talking about her mom or her dad. And then I listened to Dawson's critique, and they said that she was talking about Dawson, which makes more sense when you really think about it. But the reason why I thought she was talking about her dad was because her dad cheated on her mom. And so but then I really thought about it, and when she said, look, she's 16 years old and so are you, she was kind of talking about herself in a certain way. You think that when you change, when you get older, things are going to change. It's not always going to be the same. It's not like you're going to marry this girl, is basically what she's saying. And the older you get, the more you start, your hearts will start to change, and your minds will start to change. And she's like, but the only thing we can offer each other is forgiveness. And I couldn't do that, or at least I did too late. Don't let yourself get too angry where you start loving too late, because one day you'll wake up from that anger and the person you love will be gone. So in a lot of ways she was talking about Dawson, but I think in another way she was talking about herself, because she was so scared of what Dawson would react like. And it wasn't her anger towards Dawson was any ridiculous or any type of way. Her anger towards Dawson made so much sense, but it was true that you're young, you're supposed to break up and you're supposed to find a way to get together, but in another way you're supposed to find out where your life is, and where your heart is set with someone. And little did they know that they were going to be together, but it was just kind of proof that this was Joey trying to give Pacey advice, and I wouldn't say it's not good advice. I would say it was. Obviously, Dawson and Joey are complete different things than Pacey and Joey, but I do feel like she gave him the best advice that she knew, which I thought was really sweet. So this scene ends, but we want to remember what Joey says, because Pacey does walk up to Andy in scene 3 of Pacey. And it cuts to Pacey walking towards Andy at their spot, and Andy says, I was hoping you'd find me here. And Pacey says, to be honest, I told myself 1,000 times not to come. And Andy asks, so why did you? And Pacey says, because I owed you that much. And Andy says, I already told you how sorry I am. What else can I say? And Pacey says, there's nothing else to say. Andy says, so you don't think you can forgive me? Pacey says, whether I can forgive you or not, Andy, is not going to be keeping us apart. What you did, our relationship was like a beautiful thing, and I don't think you'll ever realize how powerful it was. You changed my life, Andy. You were the person that was there for me. You inspired me to be the man I dreamed about being. When you first got sick, it dawned on me that I may not be the person for you, and I can never go back to loving you the way knowing that my love wasn't strong enough the first time around. I could always forgive you, Andy, but I will never forget. And Andy says, I still love you, Pacey. And Pacey says, goodbye, Andy. And they were holding hands, and Pacey just dropped her hand. But in this scene, I want to say there was 2 things that I want to point out. So number one, my saddest part of this whole scene was the fact that he said, I can never go back to loving you the way I did, knowing that my love wasn't strong enough the first time around. And he was saying how Andy changed him in so many different ways, but I feel like this was kind of like a closure scene, like back to the Taylor Swift scene. Yes, I got your letter, yes, I'm doing better. Like, but it's finally time for him to move on. Like, it's time for him to find a way to get better, find a way for her to get better. And I'm going to read the Taylor Swift lyrics again, because I feel like this is not only Andy's point of sight, but it's also Pacey's point of sight when you look at this part. It says, it's been a long time, and seeing the shape of your name still spells out the pain. It wasn't right the way it all went down, looks like you know that now. Yes, I got your letter, yes, I'm doing better, it cut to know right to the bone. Yes, I got your letter, yes, I'm doing better, I know it's over, I don't need your closure. Don't treat me like some situation that needs to be handled. I'm fine with my spent and my tears and my candles and my beers and my candles. I can feel you smoothing me over. And then it continues, yes, I got your letter. Yes, I'm doing better. A cut to know me right to the bone. Yes, I got your letter. Yes, I'm doing better. I know that it's over. I don't need your closure. And then, I know I'm just a wrinkle in your new life. Staying friends would be iron. Guilty reaching out across the stage. But this part kind of reminds me of Joey and Pacey. So another thing that kind of reminds me of Pacey and Joey was Olivia, Pacey and Andy was Olivia Rodrigo. I don't really know how to say her name, but there was one song. I have to find it. Happiness reminds me of them too in this episode. I like very sad episodes and sad songs. Oh, Traitor reminds me of them. I don't know why that reminds me of that. Like, but you're still a traitor. Let's see. Hope That You're Okay. That was a good one because I feel like I Hope That You're Okay. It was, okay. So those are the songs that, I know it's like newer songs, but those two kind of remind me. I just listen to them too a lot because lately I haven't been listening to music. I've been listening to a lot more podcasts, obviously. So another thing that I want to point out with this scene was when Pacey says, whether I can forgive you or not, Andy, it's not going to keep us apart. What you did, our relationship was like a beautiful thing, and I don't think you realize how powerful it was. So when Pacey goes on to say, you changed my life, it was one of those scenes where you can just tell how much Pacey loved Andy. And it wasn't the fact that Andy cheated on him, or it wasn't the fact that Andy was having a hard time with everything. It was the fact that she knew that their love wasn't strong enough, and he knew that their love wasn't strong enough. So I think it goes back to what Joey said earlier, where she says, we talk like we know what's going on, but we don't. We have no idea. Look, we're young and we're going to screw up. You know, our minds keep changing, and sometimes even our hearts. And that's the only thing we get to offer each other is forgiveness. And I think that's why he forgave her. Because he knew that if he forgave her, that Andy would expect more. However, Pacey added on to it by saying, you don't realize how much you changed me, and that's what hurt the most. Obviously, you were in your right mind, but that doesn't change the fact that you did sleep with someone else. And he was obviously so hurt by it. And even if Andy didn't sleep with someone, I feel like they wouldn't end up together. It was just one of those, or for a long time. Like, I feel like if this was a whole different thing, I don't think Andy and Pacey would end up together because there was a lot of things that were going on. But with Joey, and she said how our hearts changed, it was how Pacey said, like, my love wasn't strong enough, I could always forgive you, but I will never forget. He was like, I will never forget the times where you made me happy, but I also will never forget the times that you made me feel the worst. That's kind of what Pacey is saying in this scene. So then we have scene 2 of Joey, and it cuts to Mitch and Dawson arriving home, and Mitch signals Dawson towards the dogs because Joey's sitting there. And Dawson goes up to her, and Dawson says, hey, and Joey says, hey. And Dawson asks what she's doing here, and Joey says, I'm not sure. Your house is like Magnet North. Certain nights just draws me in. While you were gone this summer, those days I would just go back to my boat and come riding past your dock. For old sakes, I guess. And I feel like it wasn't the fact that Joey wanted to go back, it was the fact that Joey wanted her safe place back. And Dawson says, we can't go back, Joey. And Joey says, I know, it's like a phase, isn't it? Can't go back home again. I just realized that for a while, earlier tonight. And Dawson says, I'm sorry you had to see that. And Joey says, don't be. I think I was meant to. In some weird way, it helped me. I mean, seeing you on that stage, something inside me clicked. And for the first time, I felt like for how wrong it would be. I mean, we don't really need to move on and to meet new people and to have a she says, we really do need to move on and we need to start meeting new people in our relationships. And Dawson says, it's weird as it happens, isn't it? You still love the person, you just stopped needing them like you used to. And Joey says, yeah, it's weird and kind of sad. So we're friends, and then we're a couple, and then we're friends again, and then a couple, so now what? And Dawson says, we're Dawson and Joey. And he takes off his necklace and he puts it around her neck, and Joey says, you think every Joey has a Dawson and every Dawson has a Joey? And Dawson says, I hope so, for their sake. And the camera zooms out and it ends right there. So for this scene, I feel like when this is kind of like Joey and Dawson, not really like, not saying that they're not friends, but I think kind of making a little bit of peace, kind of what Pacey was doing to Andy. I feel like Pacey and Joey were both doing the same thing in this episode. They were both trying to make peace and move on. And with this scene with Joey, it was like Dawson was her safe place and is her safe place for a long time. And it's hard for her to see someone them to move on. But I think in this scene, it wasn't that Joey was trying to be jealous or she was like, oh, like, I know I said I never want to talk to you again, but this, like, how dare you move on? It was kind of like one of those things where she was trying to make peace with not by Dawson, but by her heart. Like, it was one of those things where she knew, like, her heart needed to move on. She came to the realization that that's what her heart is telling her. Like, she needs to move on, and he's okay to move on, and it's not wrong, and it's okay. And as weird as it is, you can still stop needing the person, but it doesn't stop the part where your heart will hurt, and it will hurt for a long time. But I feel like when Joey saw Dawson on that stage making out with Eve, I feel like when she said something clicked in me, it was the fact that something clicked in her that this wasn't the same Dawson and Joey in season 1 and season 2. It was Dawson and Joey that needed to grow up and move on and learn lessons. And I feel like that's where Joey was coming from. Like, when she said the first time, I felt how wrong it would be, like, to go back to each other. That's basically what she was saying. And how wrong it would be to start this whole thing over again, from being friends to a couple and then friends to a couple. Like, why should we keep doing this if we know in our hearts it's not going to work out? And I feel like throughout all this episode, like, we see how Joey relates back to Pacey, and this is why I cover the individual parts and just not like them two together, because when you really think about it, this was kind of like a closure for both of them. Like, it was a closure because Andy was cheating and Dawson had moved on. So there was Joey and then there was Pacey. And both of them were trying to move on from the two, and both of them realized, probably at the exact same time, in that truck, in Pacey's dad's truck, that them two, they needed to move on. That they, obviously not with each other, but like with their partners, like them two, like their partners were able to move on because they were 16 and they have certain abilities to go on. If a person stayed, and obviously they're a person that stays with their high school sweethearts, and that's wonderful, but if a person stayed with their high school sweetheart at 16 and they knew in their heart it wasn't going to work out, then it would end up being like a Dawson and Joey situation where you feel safe in that situation. And I love how Pacey just knew that that Andy and him couldn't end up together, because if they ended up together, then it would just be like this thing where Pacey knew in his heart that he couldn't forget. Like, when you really think about it, it's hard when someone, like, cheated on you. Like, do you forgive that person? Do you continue going on? I think I listened to a podcast this week where they were talking about cheating. Like, it's kind of hard to be with someone when you know that they're like a cheater. Whether that is, oh my goodness, I can't remember what they said or what podcast it was. Like, you can forget the cheater and you can move on, but obviously it's not good for them two to be together. But obviously, like, you can stay together and that's your decision. But it's right for you to move on, because obviously it wasn't working out in the first place. In years to come, they have full rights to be with each other later. However, that's not really where it goes, but it was kind of like that scene where you just see how Andy was affected by the summer and Pacey was affected by the summer, and obviously 2 months apart was kind of like a Dawson and Joey situation where they needed to be apart in order to wrap their minds whether they were meant to be at all. I feel like time and space dragged them apart. Obviously the cheating dragged Pacey and Andy apart, but I feel like time and space really drew them apart, because Andy wasn't in her right mind, and then time away from Pacey, not seeing him every day but seeing another boy every single day, was a part where she was like, dang, like, this sucks, but at least there's another guy here that will help my pain. And I feel like Andy was not in her right mind, and there was a boy there that made it worse, and I don't know why they were in the room together to be able to have sex, but apparently that's what happened. And with Joey, it wasn't like there was any cheating involved, or there was another girl, there was another girl, but it wasn't like any cheating was involved. However, she knew the pain of what Pacey was going through, because there was another girl in the picture. Like, she had to watch Dawson move on, and it was so painful to her. It was kind of like cheating in a certain way, even though it wasn't cheating. It was like, oh man, like, dang, like, he moved on. And obviously Dawson had to experience that when Jack and Joey ended up, like, together in season 2. But it was that certain, like, astonishment that people can move on, and that's painful to realize when you have your first love, and I feel like that's what this whole episode is basically about. So, like I was saying earlier, this episode was Joey moving on and Pacey moving on from their lovers and cutting it off, and I feel like that's how they got closer when this whole season goes on. And that is one of my reasons why this whole episode is really good, because it just shows how much growth they'll go through as the show goes on. So, if you like this episode, please make sure to subscribe on the YouTube channel. That's Jacey's Creek Podcast, where I post every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. There's also other platforms that you can listen to, such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Make sure to review this podcast with kind words, please, only. Make sure you comment, subscribe, share, whatever you need to do. And also, you can catch every episode again on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I would love to hear your thoughts on Instagram. That's Witter and Potter. And my TikTok is Pacey and Joey. I hope to see you guys again Friday and Saturday and Sunday. I love hearing your guys' thoughts, so please, 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 please make sure to comment down below. Bye, guys.